Manus, today you want to talk a little bit about comparing Indian and American culture because this is part of you, right?
Yep.
Maybe start by talking a little bit about how you're part American and part Indian.
So I was born in America near Chicago, and then at 1 year old, when I was 1 year old, I ended up moving back to India with family and lived here till I was about 6, and then moved back to the U.S. So at 7, I was near Chicago again in Illinois. At 12, I moved to Connecticut, which is near Boston and New York, and then I pretty much grew up there, did most of my schooling there, went to college there, and then I recently only moved back to India a few months ago. My parents actually moved in 2022 with my younger brother, and then I joined them somewhat recently.
You spent quite a bit of while in Connecticut, right?
Yeah. So basically like 11, 12 years.
What's Connecticut like?
Connecticut is, it's made up of a lot of small towns, kind of like a more low-key lifestyle, not too flashy, compared to in social media you see big cities like Boston and New York that are always buzzing. It's different from that. Connecticut is, more so about like small towns where, it's family atmosphere, big neighborhoods where, it's very open, a lot of forests and stuff, a lot of greenery. So it's more of like a kind of subdued living in Connecticut. But I will say it often gets boring. So people often, for even weekend trips or other things, they end up traveling, especially to Boston and New York, to get kind of a taste of that high-paced lifestyle. But I would say Connecticut is more so like family oriented. So like people with kids growing up who are looking for a good schooling system, Connecticut is known for that. So overall, Connecticut is more family oriented, like very open, lots of wildlife, things to do outdoors compared to like, bigger cities with high rises and such. It's more of a high-paced lifestyle. But Connecticut, from what I saw, it was more people in their late 30s, 40s who have families who kind of want to, live a low-key lifestyle.
Is it culturally diverse?
It is becoming more culturally diverse over time. So when I moved there at 12, there weren't too many other cultures. So me being Indian American, in my year at school there were maybe like 4 or 5 when I started, but over time more and more people from other cultures have started moving to Connecticut, and especially in the last 3-4 years there's been a lot of influx of Indian Americans especially. So I have family friends who have their own friends, and I don't live there anymore, but from what I hear there's a lot of other cultures coming into Connecticut too. So in the past it was more of a white dominant area, but over time as in America, like people from other cultures are generally doing economically better than you could say white Americans. So like people, if they have the means and monetary wealth to kind of live in a nicer part of the US, they often choose Connecticut, especially considering that the New England region, so like the top right part of the US, it's known for not just good schools but also good universities. Like all the Ivies are there, and the state colleges for Connecticut, Massachusetts and such are very highly ranked too. So because other cultures, especially Indian and Asian cultures, they value education very highly, a lot of people end up kind of migrating to that part of the US. And especially if for state schools there's in-state tuition, which is state colleges, there's in-state tuitions which is considerably lower. So other cultures often are very careful about their money and don't like to overspend. So it's oftentimes people move into Connecticut in that area thinking about their kids. So that's why I was saying that it's more of a family-oriented lifestyle there.
So it's good for families.
Yeah.
What about for people of Indian ethnicity? How is it growing up there as an Indian in Connecticut?
You know, people, like, as I was growing up, I would come back to the US. People would often, ask me if there's racism and all, and, like, if I experienced racism, and I personally did not. But I think part of that is the whole, like, New England culture being more progressive and kind of open about different cultures and, different perspectives on life. Maybe in other parts of the US that are more, kind of have older American ideals, there may be racism. I've heard about it, but I personally have not experienced it. So being an Indian American living in, in Illinois first and then Illinois first and then Connecticut, I had a pretty good, life. I made friends that were really good, and yeah, overall I enjoyed it a lot.
How would you describe the school system in US?
So I think you're only able to succeed if you have personal motivation, and they believe in a more holistic like way of living life. So like in other cultures, especially India, education is the most important things, and in many ways it is so. But what I like about American culture and the schooling system there is that they don't want you to be just like focused on that one thing. They want you to, take part in extracurricular things, sports, other clubs, and, instruments, things like that. And I think that makes you a more sociable person and kind of helps you be more than, just good at studying and reading books.
As an Indian American, when you were in the States, how did you keep in touch with your Indian roots and heritage?
Well, one thing, especially, as I said, I spent my early few years in India, so I learned English and Hindi simultaneously, so I became fluent at Hindi. And then, so one big way I kept my cultural roots alive was speaking in Hindi to my parents at home. And oftentimes other Indian American friends of mine, like family friends and other people I had met who were born and lived their whole life in the US, they didn't know Hindi at most. They could understand it, but they didn't speak it. And like my brother was like that as well. He was born in 2008, at which point we were already in America. So like he was born and, grew up in the US, and he couldn't speak in Hindi at all. And over time he learned how to understand it, but he still wasn't able to, have that kind of like easy conversation with our parents. And like he moved to India, as I mentioned, in 2022, and he has since become, good at Hindi. There's still an accent, but he can, have a proper conversation in Hindi and all. But even him and we still speak in English to each other because that's just, what we're used to.
In America, you are a minority, right?
Yeah.
And then when you're in India, you are Indian, but at the same time, you are a little bit different culturally because you have that American in you. So how do you reconcile these two parts of you?
I will say, being part of like a multicultural background, it often feels like you don't fully belong anywhere. Like when I was in the US, I, still had my Indian background and family, so I was often had a different perspective on many things compared to, Caucasian or like traditionally white people. And then since I've come to India a few months ago, like I've made friends and all here, but it's just a different lifestyle and way I grew up, different kind of focuses in life, different family dynamics. So you often feel like you don't belong, but you try to go at it with an open mind. And I will say like areas of India such as Gurgaon, which are becoming more and more westernized, it becomes easier. So a lot of people here are aware of how the Western lifestyle is, and a lot of families being more progressive, they're kind of adopting a lot of Western policies, and a lot of kids here are hoping to go to college in America as well. So people, are having more holistic lifestyles, not just going off of education. And yeah.
On the topic of family dynamics, how would you compare that in the US versus in India?
Well, me, having an Indian family and an Indian background, we always, believed in, being connected close to each other and having certain morals, kind of, holding things like religion at a high regard. And kind of the American family dynamic, from what I saw, was like kids especially were more independent. Families weren't really that connected. Like after high school, kids basically moved out. They went to college and then they ended up living alone, and they lost touch with their parents. And that's why you see a lot of like older people in America, living in old age homes, and I feel very bad for them. Like they're alone, their kids and grandkids at that point are in other parts of the world, and it just becomes very lonely. I feel, especially if your significant other dies, it's just sad. So that's one thing I do like about India, is that like families are more connected, and kids are there for their parents even after they are done with school. Like there's that connection the whole time. But I will say that since COVID, I've noticed that the Indian kind of culture in terms of family is becoming more and more prevalent in the US. So oftentimes what I saw in the past was that right after college, kids would prefer to just move out of home and live their own life on their own accord. But I've noticed more so that kids often end up after graduation going back to living with their parents for a few years, and that way they're able to, it's mostly because they want to save money from rent and food. But I think a direct effect of that is they become closer to their family. So we'll see how it goes in the future. That's just like the kind of current trend that I've noticed, and we'll see the after effects of that in the future in terms of how family dynamics work. But in India, it's family is very important in many things. The way kids grow up and marriage, even families have a huge say in that. In America, like things like arranged marriage is not common at all. But there can be downsides to having such a like ingrained family dynamic. You at times may have less independence, like compared to when I was living in the US. So back then, even my parents, they still kind of adopted a lot of American customs and kind of the culture. So I feel that I did have more independence in terms of doing things my own way, especially once I went to college. And so since moving to India and my parents are here, they've kind of readopted a lot of like the Indian cultural ideals. So here I feel like I do have less independence. So it's oftentimes kind of figuring out how to balance the independence along with the family aspect of it. So
The Indian diaspora is very known, especially in US, for flourishing economically.
Yeah,
They're business families and they do very well. They really prosper.
Yep.
From what you've seen, is there a specific equation about this, or why, from your perspective, have you noticed they flourishing so much in US?
I would say it's partly because Indian Americans there adopt some American cultural ideals, but basically they still focus primarily on Indian ideals. So putting school first, kind of having that family connection. So your parents are there for you, you're there for your parents. And so the the American kind of thought on career is that you choose your own career and you go about it a certain way. And the traditional Indian philosophy, maybe it's changing over time, but it was more so your parents leading you down a path. But I think the independence in choosing what you want to do for the rest of your life kind of helps you, succeed. But what else can I say? Yeah, I think the main thing is still having the focus on education, which is the most important thing for setting up setting you up for a foundation. Uh, Also, one other thing is that Indian Americans and other cultures, from what I've heard and what I personally have experienced, the parents will, pay for your bachelor's degree. And for American, like traditional Americans, oftentimes the kids end up taking loans. So I think that's part of, early career that like they're worrying about student loans and they have to kind of live somewhat frugally compared to Indian Americans where their parents pay for their college and then they go on to do their own thing. But because, families are close, so your parents help you out at that point, and then further down in life, you help out your parents and you're still kind of, connected to them.
So since moving to India, what is one thing that you miss the most about US?
As I mentioned, some of the independence I do miss. I miss my friends back home, but one thing that, just kind of comes out at me is driving. I miss driving there. Roads and such are very open there. And I am able to drive back in the US, but here, because of traffic and all, I can't really drive. So cars are too close to each other and I don't have that much space awareness. So I think that also has the effect of me feeling less independent here because I have to rely on others to kind of get around. So
When you were in the US, did you feel more connected to the US, or when you're in India, do you feel more connected to India?
I mean, I would say I felt more connected to the US because other cultures are still a part of US. They call it the melting pot for a reason. So it's not just one ideal that people have. People are very flexible, open to different modes of thought. People, learn from others, teach others. So I feel like I personally am like a mix of, as I said, different cultures and American kind of, the world there is the same way. So I felt more connected there. I felt more comfortable there, especially because, I mostly grew up in the US. So that's the way of life I learned. And then in India, it's kind of, different customs and ideals and such. So I often feel like I am different. But in the US, because there's a lot of other people in the same boat as me there, of being, having families of different cultural backgrounds. So I felt very comfortable there compared to coming back here.
So I have noticed online that there is also a trend of people moving back from the US to their native homelands, especially
Yeah.
Indian Americans moving back to India, like we
Yeah,
saw with
yeah.
you. Do you know the reason behind this trend?
I would say it has to do mostly with economy. The economy in the US is kind of struggling. People are having a tough time finding jobs and such. And conversely, the Indian economy especially is at a very high development rate. A lot of, international companies are coming back, like opening up here. There's a lot of startups and, the economy overall is booming. So I think it's about finding career success. So people move back here for that reason. But I would say also because India is becoming more progressive as well, becoming more westernized. So people, are somewhat comfortable moving back to India, especially places like Gurgaon and Bangalore, which are, more culturally westernized. So it's primarily, I would say, because of career, but there's other reasons that go into it as well. And I would also say that, as I mentioned, like since COVID, the American culture has kind of, become bigger. It's become more prevalent to be close to your family, but I think that has also had the same effect on like cultural backgrounds of people in the US. So even I noticed for myself that I got closer to my family, and so the same thing I could say was true for my parents because everything was connected online. So they got more connected to family back home, and because they got close, they were comfortable moving back to the US moving back to India. And I think a rise of the remote jobs and the online work environment has a huge part to do with that. And that's the main factor that led to my parents moving here. So for the longest time, they had in-person jobs. So even if they wanted to move, they couldn't because they had to work there. But once their jobs became remote, they had, flexibility and the ability to live anywhere in the world. And, they were born and raised in India, so they had that like family dynamic. They held that to high regard, and especially with my grandparents becoming older, they wanted to come back here, be with family, and experience the Indian lifestyle after a long time. So I think all of that has contributed to this kind of trend of people moving to back to India or their native countries. And like the flip side of that is I've noticed that America especially, the kind of glamour it used to hold about, during my dad's time, like in the 90s, 2000s, there was a whole glamour about moving to the US and it was held in high regard. But I think because India is progressing so much and developing so much and people are very successful here, I think that's part of the reason that, people often prefer now to live in India compared to America.
So we fleshed out this topic, being an Indian American in
Yep.
US versus India,
Yep.
quite well. I
Yep.
want to ask you a question about you, if you don't mind. Do you
Yeah.
have your eyes set on any particular goal for the future or any exciting things you're looking forward to?
So was finishing my bachelor's up till 2023, and at that point I got a full-time offer and ended up opting for that, especially given the American economy. But I wasn't really enjoying the job itself, and then living alone because my parents moved in 2022. I ended up having to find my own place, so that was kind of getting to me, especially because being part of like Indian culture, it's a big part of being surrounded by people, family, and all, and so that was still part of me. So I found living alone tough. So I recently, a few months ago, moved to India. I'm finishing up my bachelor's right now. Should be done, by the end of summer, fall time, and then after that, I have to sit down and think about a few things. I think it's a very complex and complicated world, especially these days with the rise of AI. And the kind of things that I am experienced with, that I have both work and educational experience in, is the corporate business side. So things like finance, analytics, accounting, and a lot of these fields are being transformed by AI. So maybe I'll go for a master's, maybe another job, but it's about figuring out a kind of career path to take that is safe for the future. So. And part of that, I think, going back to our discussion about Indian versus American culture, because business is, booming here and much more affordable given the cost of life in India, I think that's another thing to consider about, going for business in India, and you have a very high chance of success. You don't have to invest as much compared to US, so that's definitely a viable option. So, just kind of thinking about all these things, taking different factors into account, and then, hopefully by the start of next year, knowing what career path I'll take. So.
That's awesome. So we've pretty much run the end of this conversation, but I do want to ask you one question. That's what I ask everyone at the end.
Yep.
Which is, for anyone watching, do you have any general piece of advice you could maybe get them?
Don't stay stuck on the past and don't live in regret. I think that's a huge thing that I personally struggle with, having gone through certain things, and I think COVID made it a lot worse. But I think, being aware of what happened in the past, learning from that, but living in the present and looking to the future is the way to live. Because, you can't change the past, but you can affect what you do in the present, and you can plan to an extent what happens in the future. So, yeah.
Well put and well reflected. And for anyone that maybe wants to connect with you, is there any detail there?
So my name is Manus Prasad. So that's Manus Prasad, I should say, being in India. So that's MANUS PRASAD. So that's my LinkedIn. If you prefer something more casual, I have an Instagram. That's Manny P. So MANNYP101. So yeah, if you want to connect, I'd love to.
Thanks, Manus, and thanks for sharing your insight.